In question 7, we're going to build the federal funds market and then show how the Fed targets interest rates. The numbers for the demand curve and the numbers for the supply curve have all been copied and pasted into Excel. Just like in problem 2, the intercept of the demand curve is the sum of C7, which is the shock parameter, plus the product of the reserve requirement ratio, 0.1, and checkable deposits, 521.5. So the intercept is 6.12. The slope is the aversion to holding excess reserves, 0.05. The vertical section is the sum of barred reserves, $0 billion, and non-barred reserves, $78 billion. The horizontal section of the supply curve is the discount rate, 3.22%. So down here we have the supply curve, which is this part of the dashed cross, and the horizontal section here. It's the L shape right here. The demand curve, and then the equilibrium is right here. I've copied and pasted the diagram from Cengage Now here into Excel. The supply curve is the L-shaped part of the dash cross that starts at $78 billion, goes up until the discount rate of 3.22, and then goes right. The equilibrium federal funds rate is the interest rate at the intersection of demand and supply. The equilibrium federal funds rate is roughly 2.2%. Next, we want to actually calculate the equilibrium quantity of reserves, equilibrium federal funds rate, and the Fed's target for the federal funds rate. The equilibrium quantity is just 78. The target is 1 percentage point less than the discount rate. So if the discount rate is 3.22, the target is 2.22. The federal funds rate is determined by plugging the quantity of reserves into the demand for reserves. And that equals 2.22. So it looks like the federal funds rate is equal to its target. Which of the following statements is correct? The equilibrium federal funds rate is equal to its target, true. The federal funds market is in normal mode, true. So it's not in emergency mode and it's not in crisis mode. So A and B. As a result of the popping of the housing bubble in 2008 and the subsequent financial crisis, the Fed purchased trillions of dollars in securities. For simulation purposes, suppose the Fed purchased $113 billion worth of these securities from banks during the first hours of the unfolding crisis. Derive the resulting demand for and supply of reserves below. Well, when the Fed makes this purchase, at the moment it does it, nothing happens to demand. Nothing happens to the discount rate either. So the vertical section of reserves increases by $113 billion. So the new vertical section is the increase, 113, plus the original value, $78 billion. So this is the diagram from Cengage Now that I copied in. I overlaid the initial supply curve, which has a height equal to the initial discount rate of 3.22 and a vertical section equal to the initial value of reserves, $78 billion. The historic purchase pushes reserves out to this dashed line, which equals the size of the purchase and the initial level of reserves. So new reserves level is $191 billion. Now I want to compute the new quantity of reserves and the new equilibrium federal funds rate. Well, the new equilibrium is down here. So equilibrium quantity of reserves is $191 billion. Now I got to calculate the federal funds rate on the demand curve that corresponds to $191 billion. After the purchase is made, the federal funds rate drops to negative 3.43%. Which of the following statements is correct? The new equilibrium federal funds rate equals its target. That is not true. The federal funds market is still in normal mode. That is true. The federal funds market is now in emergency mode. No. The federal funds market is now in crisis mode. So it looks like B is the only correct answer. In 2008, Congress gave the Fed a new monetary policy tool, paying interest on reserves. The new tool was initially set to begin in 2011, but was moved up to October 2008. To prevent the federal funds rate from being negative, the Fed sets interest on reserves equal to 0.25. Derive the resulting demand for and supply of reserves below. Well, with interest on reserves, demand is now kinked. The downward portion of the kinked demand curve is the original demand curve. The horizontal section is the value of interest on reserves, 0.25%. The supply curve is the value of the new level of reserves, in this case 191. And the horizontal section of supply is the discount rate. Down here you see the downward portion of the demand curve. It kinks at interest on reserves. This right here is the supply curve. This kink part is the supply curve. And you see that demand crosses supply on the vertical section, which is $191 billion. So the federal funds rate equals interest on reserves. And because of that, and the fact that interest on reserves is 0.25%, the federal funds rate is 0.25%. So the discount rate must be 1.25%. I've copied and pasted this diagram here into Excel. Here I've added the flat kinked portion of the demand curve that is at the height of interest on reserves, 0.25%. The supply curve is kinked at $191 billion and then goes to the right at the new discount rate of 1.25%. The new equilibrium, which occurs right here, the intersection of the kinked demand curve and the kinked supply curve, has an equilibrium quantity of $191 billion and the federal funds rate equal to 0.25%. Which of the following is true? The new equilibrium federal funds rate is equal to its target. However, the federal funds market is no longer in normal mode. It's not in emergency mode. It is in crisis mode. So A and D are correct. Suppose the Fed buys $113 billion more worth of securities for banks to further combat the effects of the housing bubble popping and the 2000 financial crisis. So what happens here is the supply of reserves goes from this kinked line now to this kinked line. Since the demand curve, which is now kinked at interest on reserves, crosses the old and new supply curve for reserves at the same height, 0.025, the federal funds equilibrium interest rate does not change, but the quantity of reserves changes considerably. So if the Fed purchases securities and then sells those securities, then purchases those securities, then sells those securities, the federal funds interest rate does not change. It remains at the interest on reserves rate. However, reserves bounces out and then bounces back in, bounces out and then bounces back in. If the federal funds market remains in crisis mode as the Fed buys and sells securities, the equilibrium federal funds rate does not rise, does not fall, the quantity of reserves can rise, can fall. So C and D. If the federal funds market remains in crisis mode, the Fed will do which of the following when it raises the target federal funds rate? Raise the interest rate it pays on reserves by the same amount. Yes. Raise the discount rate by the same amount. Yes. So A and D are true. Now I'm going to check my work, and I should get everything correct. And it looks like I get everything. Well, I got everything but 2008 correct. This actually should be 2006 because the legislation was in 2006. So in 2006, Congress gave the Fed a new monetary policy tool, paying interest on reserves. The new tool was initially set to begin in 2011, but was moved to October of 2008. So now everything should be correct. And it looks like everything is now correct.